I balanced a tray of steaming mugs in my hands and told myself the laughter from the den was harmless, just cousins being silly, but the sound had a sharp edge tonight, like glass under a towel. The hallway smelled of cinnamon and pine, the string lights blinked against the framed family photos, and my mother, Elaine, had just called me, so reliable, Leah, which always meant I should keep moving and not make noise. I set the tray on the sideboard, wiped my palms on my skirt, and walked toward the den where the kids had a small table set with paper crowns and candy canes. My daughter, Ava, 11, sat at the end of the bench with her hands in her lap, shoulders high like she was holding her breath. Beside her, cousin Harper, also 11, grinned at the circle like a stage light had found her. The TV was muted but flashing, and I could hear the adults in the dining room clinking cutlery and praising the roast I had basted. Then I heard it clearly. Ava's not as smart, and the room burst into a big rolling laugh that seemed to shove the air out of my lungs. I stepped inside and nobody noticed me at first. Harper's chin lifted, her eyes bright, and one of the younger cousins added, "She's more annoying," and the laugh grew louder, messier, like a crowd that tasted blood. My sister Bella's voice floated in from the doorway, smooth and amused. "Say it nicer. Harper learns quicker." And the circle rewarded her with giggles. Ava didn't move. She stared at the paper crown in front of her as if stillness could make her invisible. I felt my heartbeat in my throat, and a small, clear thought cut through the noise. This is the game. I crossed the rug, the pine needles cracking under my heel, and the laughter thinned with each step. I placed my hand on Ava's shoulder, warm but trembling, and looked to my husband, Mark, who was on a floor cushion showing a block tower to the youngest. He smiled because he had only heard laughter and not the words behind it. "Get your coat," I said, and my voice did not shake. The room fell silent so fast I could hear the wall clock tick in the hall. "Now?" Mark asked, already rising because he knew the look on my face. Somewhere behind me, my mother called from the dining room, "Leah? Is everything all right?" And Bella stepped fully into the doorway, clutching a napkin like a flag. I turned to the kids, to the small open mouths, to Harper's startled blink, and spoke in the same calm voice I use for code reviews and fire alarms. "This is the last time you'll see us." The words stood in the air like frost. I took Ava's hand, and she stood without a sound. Her fingers felt cold and small, but she held on. We passed the tree with its blinking lights, and the bowl of spiced nuts I had made, and the stack of plates I would not wash tonight. In the foyer, I zipped Ava's coat, tied her scarf, and opened the door to the clean cold. Mark slipped his arms into his jacket, glanced back once, then followed. The porch boards creaked under our steps, the night breathed in our faces, and the snow at the curb reflected the lights like a warning. When we were in the car and the doors shut, the world softened. Ava stared out the window, cheeks pale, lips pressed thin. Mark wrapped his hands around the wheel but didn't start the engine. He looked at me, question in his eyes, and I answered without looking away from our daughter. "They made a list of why Harper was better," I said. Mark swallowed. He turned the key, the engine coughed, then settled. As the house shrank in the rear view, I felt something old and heavy loosen inside me, a knot that had held since my own childhood. They thought it was a game, a harmless joke. The truth was colder, and it had a clock on it. By the time the lights of that house disappeared around the bend, I knew exactly what I would write and exactly how many days it would give. Mark pulled away from the curb, and the car filled with a heavy quiet, the kind that isn't peaceful but tight in the chest. The wipers clicked across the windshield, even though there was no snow falling, a nervous habit he has when he's thinking. I watched the house shrink in the mirror until the warm windows became small points and then nothing. Ava's breath fogged the glass beside her cheek, a white flower that opened and closed. I kept my hands flat on my knees so I wouldn't turn around and beg her to tell me everything right there in the dark. "What happened?" Mark asked at last, voice careful like he was touching a hot pan. I swallowed and said, "They made a game out of her. They listed reasons Harper was better, and the word better felt like grit in my mouth." Mark stared at the road, jaw tight, and said, "I didn't hear it." And I nodded, because that was the trick my family always used. Wrap cruelty in laughter and call it fun. We said nothing else until we reached our driveway, the porch light we forgot to switch off, throwing a pale circle on the steps. Inside, the house smelled like laundry and lemon soap. Safe smells. I hung up my coat and turned to Ava, who still had her hat on, eyes on her shoes. "It was just a joke," she whispered before I could ask, and the words hit me like a cold wave because I knew that line by heart. I heard my mother's voice in my head, "Don't be so sensitive." And I saw myself at 11 with big glasses and a tray I never put down. I knelt so I was level with Ava and took her hands, the knit of her gloves rough under my palms. "Jokes that hurt are not jokes," I said, slow and clear. "You are not less. You are not annoying. You are mine, and I will not let anyone treat you that way." Her mouth trembled and she blinked hard. "But if I leave every time, I won't have friends," she murmured. I felt something old and stubborn move under my ribs, like a locked door giving way. "Then we find different people," I said. "People who laugh with you, not at you." Mark stood by the counter, listening, his face puzzled and angry all at once. "Leah," he said softly, "how long has this been happening?" I told him about Thanksgiving when Ava tried to explain her science project and Bella cut her off. I told him about the robotics kit and how my mother clapped for Harper's cheer routine while Ava sat twisting her fingers under the table. I told him how I kept telling myself it was small, that I was imagining the pattern because it matched my past too well. And then I told him the part I had never said out loud. 5 years ago, I bought Bella's house in my name because she could not get a loan, and I have paid every mortgage bill since. As I spoke, the kitchen seemed to grow clearer instead of dimmer. The hum of the fridge, the soft tick of the wall clock, the scratch of Mark's ring against the ceramic mug he was holding. "So they live in your house?" he said, stunned. "And they do this to our kid?" I nodded. The shame wasn't mine, but I felt its heat anyway. Mark breathed out through his nose, a short, sharp sound. "What do you want to do?" he asked. I looked toward the hallway where Ava's door had just closed with a gentle click. I thought of the list they made and the way Harper's laugh had filled the room. I thought of my mother's calm voice steering the game. I pulled my laptop onto the table, the screen lighting my hands a clean white, and said, "I'm writing a notice. 30 days. The words felt simple, like a clean cut. Mark didn't argue. He pulled out a chair and sat beside me, shoulder to shoulder, a weight I could lean against. Keys tapped, sentences formed. I kept it short and clear, because that is how a boundary should read. When I finished, I printed 2 copies and slid one across to Mark. The paper felt warm and thin. "Are you sure?" he asked one more time. "Yes," I said, and for the first time all night my voice sounded like it belonged to me. I placed the letter in an envelope and sealed it with my thumb. The glue tasted like chalk and finality. In the silence that followed, the house seemed to listen with me. Somewhere beyond our street, the night held its breath. The next morning, the house felt different, like the air had been rearranged while we slept. Sunlight came thin through the blinds, the kettle hissed, and the small ordinary sounds, keys on the counter, a passing car, suddenly had weight, as if they could announce something. I made coffee with hands that did not want to tremble and pinched my lips until the heat did not bite. Mark checked his phone and said, "They already called?" And I shook my head because the outgoing tray with the letter had gone with the post, and I wanted the first ring to be theirs, not mine. By noon, the silence broke. My phone buzzed with Bella's name, and I watched the digits blink like a dare. When I answered, she roared so loud I could hear the anger through the plastic of the screen. Things torn, words thrown, accusations that I was trying to ruin her life. I let her blow until she finished, and the sound drained out. Then I spoke in the same steady tone I use at work when code breaks and the system needs a restart. "You have 30 days, I said. She called me a coward, a thief of family, and then slammed the line down as if sound could hurt paper. Minutes later, my mother called with syrup in her voice, softness that had always been productive, and she begged me gently, "Think of Harper. Think of the children." I kept picturing Ava's small hands folded under the den table and said simply, "I thought of children when I paid the mortgage for 5 years. The line went quiet long enough for both of us to hear the furnaces click. She asked me to be reasonable, and I answered, "I am reasonable. They were not reasonable tonight." After that call, the day dragged like a shoe stuck in mud. Neighbors walked dogs past our window, their breath white, oblivious. And in the living room, Ava built a paper town on the floor with her blocks, while Mark read a book beside her, trying to make the ordinary ring like a bell again. Mid-afternoon, the realtor arrived. A woman with a calm smile and a tablet, who moved around our house like someone measuring how much a life could be rearranged. She asked practical questions and said, "We'll note the deed, get photos, schedule viewings." Her voice kept the future small and manageable, and for a moment I could think in steps. First the listing, then showings, then the offer, each step a promise that the letter would not be a hollow thing. That night, the threat started in a different form. Texts from Bella's husband, shaky and venomous, promising a scene at any showing. An anonymous voicemail left on our answering machine, a man's voice saying, "You don't want to make enemies of your blood." And the sound sat in my chest like a stone. Mark wanted to call the police. I said not yet, because evidence matters more than anger. And we documented every message and printed them into folders labeled with dates like small flags. For 3 days, the family bartered between pleading and promise. My father visited once and watched the steaming pie on the counter without tasting it, his eyes searching my face for a crack. He left with a folded newspaper and a sentence that felt like a verdict. "You always were difficult." I believed that once. That label stuck like sap to my skin, and it stung now because it meant they had not changed. Meanwhile, small things shifted inside the house. Ava began talking about a kid in her class who liked the same comic books. She read aloud with her voice finding a new stitch of confidence. At night, Mark and I sat in a quiet that had room for plans. College savings, a new fence, a schedule for showings to protect Ava's evenings. The tension grew like frost from the edges inward, a cold that people pretend is wind. Then on the 4th day, the first official showing was booked. I left a polite note for my parents, explaining the process and asking them not to interfere. And when I walked it to their door, I felt my hands small and steady. The house smelled of lemon oil and winter bread, and the front step felt like the edge of the world. That evening, as snow began in thin vanishing flakes and the streetlight haloed the sidewalk, I sat at my kitchen table and read the list of reasons they had laughed at Ava years ago, like it was a script someone else had written for my life. I folded the list into a small square and put it in the bottom of a drawer. No flame, no shouting, just the quiet action of putting something away. And I felt for the first time in a long while the slow building of a quiet power that was not revenge so much as protection. Somewhere far off, I guessed, someone in my old life was whispering that I had gone too far, but in the warm light of my kitchen, with Ava asleep down the hall and Mark steady breathing in the next room, I knew I had finally chosen us, and that choosing would change everything. The morning the truck arrived, the sky was low and gray like someone had pulled a blanket over the neighborhood. When I drove down the street, my stomach tightened because the curb already held a big boxy shadow, and a man wrestled a sofa toward the driveway while children clustered on the sidewalk like witnesses. Bella stood by the front step with her arms folded and a face that had practiced outrage, and my parents hovered behind her like they were referees who had long ago picked sides. I parked, killed the engine, and felt the cold settle in my bones. Not the weather cold, but the kind that comes when the rules change. As I walked up the path, the sound of the truck's door slamming punctured the air, and the boxes made a small mountain at the door. My mother's mouth opened before she thought, and she launched into a speech about how cruel and unnecessary I was, how I had humiliated them at Christmas, how I had taken away their home. My father's voice cut in, clipped. "You always did things differently," which meant they had already decided my actions were wrong. Bella jabbed a finger in my direction and said, "You were jealous, always buying love," and the way she said it made it a confession and a weapon at the same time. I stayed quiet because answers shouted back, and then the crowd would roar, and I didn't want a scene for Ava to watch from the window. Instead, I let my hands go empty and kept my voice low and even, the tone I use when explaining hard truths at work. I asked 30 days. You had your time. Bella's mouth tightened, and she hissed that I had no right to sell to strangers, that this was theft dressed as justice. A neighbor crossed the street to load a box and muttered something about family troubles. eyes down, not meeting mine. The moving men struggled with a mattress and dropped it at the curb like a weight I had finally shrugged off. Then a child's voice. One of my cousins sniveled, "You're ruining everything." And my mother flinched like a person hearing a prophecy she'd rather ignore. I thought of the years I'd paid the mortgage quietly, of the small kindnesses that had been accepted as dues instead of gratitude, and I felt no heat of shame, only a clear coldness that allowed me to see what had been hidden. Entitlement, thinly veiled as need. My father lunged forward once, then stopped because he knew the law and the truth of the deed on file. He folded his hands instead and said nothing that mattered. The truck driver called a brake and sat on the tailgate smoking. Dust from a broken box dusted the porch and looked like ash. My sister marched past me as if the ground belonged to her and shoved a box into the man's hands. She barked orders at her husband, who moved like a man who had been given responsibility without resources. I watched their faces: bruised pride, raw anger, sudden fear when buyers arrived for a viewing, and refused to be ushered away by threats. Later that day, when the front door closed for the last time with a thud, I felt like an old house had sighed. Not from loss, but from relief. The neighbors went back to their yards, their conversations picking up like nothing had happened, and the light through our windows felt sharper, as if sunlight were finally allowed to hit the room without being filtered through someone else's need. For a while, there were phone calls. My mother in tears pleading, my father talking around things, Bella sending messages that slid between venom and bargaining, promises she would change, lists of things she would do differently, threats to make the sale messy. I recorded the calls, filed screenshots, and watched each message like evidence in a case I had no wish to wage, but had to win. At night, after the truck left and the empty house sat like a body the family had abandoned, I stood at the kitchen sink with my palms in hot water and felt the thin line of the world rearrange. Mark came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, and I leaned into him because the choice had cost us a version of family we once hoped for, and the loss felt strange and raw, though necessary. Ava slept with the first new book she'd ever picked for herself on her bedside. And when I checked on her the next morning, she smiled in her sleep, and I thought, she will not carry this pattern the way I did. The days after were messy. Whispers at church gatherings, cousins choosing sides, an aunt asking for details in a voice that wanted scandal, not truth. But there was also a quieting, a clearing of space that echoed like an empty room ready for new furniture. Sometimes I catch myself replaying the silent beat between my sister's last complaint and the slam of her car door as she left. And in that beat, I hear a small sound like a hinge closing. For the first time in a life of explaining myself, I did not feel obliged to soften the edges of what I had done. I had drawn a line for my daughter and for myself, and the line held. The sale moved faster than I expected, like water finding a crack. The realtor scheduled photos, 2 showings, and by the end of the week we had an offer that didn't haggle, just asked for a closing date and a clean handover. I read the email twice, blinked at the numbers, and felt something in my chest unclench. Mark squeezed my shoulder and said, "Sign it." So I did, and the paper trail began. Disclosures, deed copies, wire instructions. I kept everything in a blue folder on the kitchen shelf, the same shelf where I used to keep extra plates for family dinners, and every time I slid the folder out, I felt the difference between feeding a habit and finishing a job. The inspection day came cold and bright. I stood on the porch of the house I had paid for and watched a man in a knit cap test windows and run water. And when Bella arrived midway with our parents flanking her, the inspector didn't even look up. He had seen this standoff before in other families, and he kept to his checklist like a metronome. My mother started with kindness. "Leah, be reasonable. Don't sell to strangers." But the softness had a brittle center now. My father stayed quiet, hands in pockets, eyes colder than the air. Bella moved closer until I could smell her peppermint gum and said low so the inspector wouldn't hear, "Call it off. You won't do this if you still want a family." And that word family stung like a splinter I'd tried to ignore. I answered with the line I'd practiced each night, "I want a safe life for Ava. The sale stands." She laughed once, short and sharp, and said, "You never were one of us." And my mother flicked her eyes at me, quick and guilty, as if the truth had slipped out early. The inspector called for signatures on a repair credit, and I signed, my hand steady, then set the pen down like a gavel. On closing day, the title officer spread pages across a long table that smelled faintly of toner and coffee. Mark sat at my left, calm and solid. The buyers, an older couple with kind faces, signed in neat loops. When it was my turn to hand over the keys, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. Last chance to stop. And beneath it, a second one from my father. You'll regret this. I turned the phone face down and slid the keys across. The title officer stamped, received, and the tiny red word felt larger than all the years behind it. Walking out, we met my parents and Bella on the sidewalk like actors who had missed their cue. Bella's mouth was already open when my mother cut ahead and said it clean this time, without syrup. The sentence I had been bracing for since childhood. You were never like us. You never fit in. The words didn't knock me back. They clarified the air. I nodded once and said, I know, because I finally did. I had been different all along, and different had built the life that kept my daughter safe. My father tried a new angle. You'll be alone. And I realized he still didn't see Mark at my side, or Ava waiting at home with her book and her new robot kit. We're not alone, I said. We're just not standing where you put us. Bella scoffed, but her eyes flicked toward the buyers carrying a plant up the steps, and for the first time I saw fear instead of fury. Fear of a world where my yes was not guaranteed. We left them there, talking to each other instead of to me, their voices small in the winter air. At home, I moved the blue folder to the back of a drawer and replaced it with a fresh notebook labeled Ava Future. And that night, we opened a new savings account with the proceeds marked for school and emergencies only. Later, while Mark washed dishes, I sat on Ava's bed and listened as she told me about a girl in her class who liked the same stories she did and had asked if they could build a wagon for their library books. I said yes, she added, and the word yes sounded different in her mouth. Chosen, not given. When she fell asleep, I stayed a moment, watching the slow rise of her chest, and felt a quiet hum in the house like a machine finally running the way it was designed. The mystery that remained wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. What could a life look like without bending, without begging, without trays and jokes to swallow? The answer was not dramatic. It was steady. It was the sound of our front door locking at night and the warm light that stayed on only for us. A year slid by in small, honest pieces. School mornings, late homework checks, weekend grocery runs. And the house learned our rhythm. The kettle hissed at 7, the front door clicked at 8, and in the afternoons I heard Ava and her new friend, Nora, thump down the hall with a wagon they'd built for library books, the wheels squeaking like a mouse that had found a voice. December came cold and bright, and I hung a string of lights across the living room window without thinking about who might approve. On the first Friday, Ava's class put on a winter reading night, and she stood at the front with her palms flat on the podium, reading a page from a book she loved, not rushing, not shrinking. I held Mark's hand and felt the simple weight of it, steady as a paperweight on a stack of new pages. Afterward, in the hallway that smelled like eraser dust and hot chocolate, a mother I didn't know touched my arm and said, "Your daughter explains things so clearly." And I felt the compliment land and stay instead of sliding off like rain. On the drive home, Nora's mom followed behind us and flashed her lights when we turned on our street just to say goodnight. And Ava laughed in the back seat in a way that didn't make my chest tighten. Inside, we set cups on the counter and unwrapped the ginger cookies the school had sent home, and I noticed how quiet the house sounded when the quiet wasn't hiding anything. There were echoes from the old life now and then, whispers through relatives, a clipped message from my father in midsummer asking if I planned to come to Thanksgiving, and then, when I said no, a shorter one that simply read, "Suit yourself." But the messages had lost their weight. The buyers of Bella's old house sent us a cheerful photo in the spring of the tree we'd planted out front, a ring of new leaves bright against the pale sky, and I kept that picture on the fridge like a reminder that decisions grow if you water them. We set up the savings account for Ava and nicknamed it North Star. And once a month, I moved the same amount I used to send to a mortgage into a future that was ours. It wasn't revenge. It was arithmetic. In late October, I ran into my mother outside the pharmacy. She had a paper bag of medicine and a folded coupon tucked into her glove, and she looked smaller than I remembered. For a second, the old script tried to climb my throat. Be pleasant, be easy, make this comfortable. But it stopped when she spoke first in a voice that held no syrup, only tiredness. How are you, Leah? I said. We're well. And she nodded and said, good, and then looked like she might add something true and didn't. We stood there long enough to hear the crosswalk beep, and then we parted. On the first snow of December, Ava and Nora built a little ramp for the wagon and tried to roll it through the powder, laughing when the wheels stuck. Mark shoveled clean lines down the walk and I salted the steps, and the simple work made a neat warmth in my chest. That evening, when the house was quiet and the tree in our window pulsed softly, a plain envelope slid through the mail slot and tapped the hardwood. There was no return address, only my name in my mother's careful print. Inside was a single photograph, the four of us, my parents Bella and me, standing on a summer lawn years ago, the sun catching dust in the air. On the back, in the same careful hand, she had written, "You were always ours," and then crossed out ours and written you. I sat at the table with the picture under my palm, feeling the edge of the paper and the weight of the crossed-out word. And for a long minute, I listened to the sounds of our house, the heater ticking on, a pipe settling, a page turning in Ava's room. And I did not feel pulled backward. I slipped the photo into the blue folder I had moved to the back of the drawer and closed it gently, not as a lid on the past, but as a quiet place for things that no longer run my life. Before bed, Ava padded out in socks and held up a new list she'd written for our weekend. Library, hot chocolate, fix the wagon's loose wheel. And I signed my name at the bottom because she'd left a line for me, as if lists could be contracts for the life we keep choosing. When the lights were off and the house went soft around us, my phone buzzed once on the nightstand. A number I didn't know. No message, no voice, just a single ring like a question. I let it stop and set the phone face down. The mystery could stay small now. My answers were here. In the steady breath down the hall, in the packed lunch on the counter, in the clear, bright fact that we were not standing where they had put us. Snow ticked against the window, and the soft, ordinary dark felt like home.